Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Close your eyes for a moment. Picture something ancient. Not old in the way a crumbling castle is old. Not aged in the way a mountain is worn smooth. But truly ancient. In a way that makes those comparisons seem almost comical. We're not talking centuries. We're not talking millennia. We're talking about 60 million years. To put that in perspective, 60 million years ago, the dinosaurs had only recently stopped existing on planet Earth. The continents were in different positions. The ocean floors were different. The species alive then share almost no genetic continuity with the species alive now. Everything that has been built, said, written, fought over, prayed to, fallen in love with, and mourned by every civilization in recorded human history happened inside the last fraction of a percent of that span of time. Now picture a thing that was conscious and active at the beginning of all that time and is still here, still conscious, still active, still pursuing goals that were formed before the mammals that would eventually become us had figured out basic locomotion. That is a Necron. They are beings of living metal, skinless and deathless, walking through a galaxy they once owned in necrodermis bodies that repair themselves from nearly anything short of total atomic dispersal. They possess weapons whose technology operates at the level of fundamental physics. Gauss weapons that strip electrons and atoms from their targets in layered, progressive waves, literally dismantling matter at the subatomic level. They command canoptech constructs, silver-bodied machines that maintain their tomb worlds through millions of years of unoccupied stasis, and tending and repairing and standing sentinel in the dark beneath worlds that other civilizations have been living on for thousands of years without knowing what sleeps below. Their cryptechs, the closest thing Necron civilization has to scientists and engineers and sorcerers all at once, can manipulate dimensions, fold space, loop time on local scales, and design weapons capable of threatening entities that exist partially outside normal physical reality. The Silent King's flagship is the size of a small moon. Necron pylons, seeded across strategic points in the galaxy millions of years ago, can suppress the entirety of the warp's influence on a regional scale. The Celestial Orrery, one of their most terrifying superweapons, is a device capable of rearranging the positions and states of actual stars. They are, in objective terms, at the most powerful material civilization in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy. Not the most dramatic, not the most actively threatening on a day-to-day basis. There are other candidates for those titles. But the most powerful when capability across all domains is assessed comprehensively, and they have fears. Not vague anxieties, not tactical concerns that register as mild operational complications. Real fears. Deep, structural, civilization-defining fears that have shaped every decision the Necrons have made since before any currently living species existed. Fears that explain why the most powerful material force in the galaxy has not simply retaken what was once theirs. Fears that explain why the Silent King, who could theoretically issue orders to billions of warriors and begin the most comprehensive military campaign in galactic history, is instead working in shadows and building pylons and making uncomfortable alliances with meat-based civilizations he finds personally beneath his notice. This video is about those fears. And I want to take my time here, because these fears are not simple. Each one has deep roots, and understanding them changes how you see the Necrons entirely. From a faction that's powerful and mysterious, to a faction that's powerful and tragic in ways that genuinely resonate. Let's start at the very beginning, because you cannot understand what the Necrons fear without understanding what happened to make them what they are. Part 1. The foundation of all fears. What biotransference actually did. Before the Necrons existed, there were the Necron Tyre. This distinction matters enormously, not as a historical footnote, but as the entire foundation of everything we are going to discuss. The Necrons are what the Necrontyr became. And what the Necrontyr became is the source of every single fear we are going to examine in this video. But before we get to what happened to the Necrontyr, I want to spend a moment on who they were. Because the fears the Necrons carry are not random. They are the specific fears of beings with a specific history, and that history shapes every other thing in this conversation. The Necrons are not simply powerful beings who happen to have some vulnerabilities. They are a civilization whose deepest wounds and deepest anxieties are inseparably connected to the original decision that made them what they are. And understanding that original decision properly means understanding who the Necrontyr were before it was made. And the 40,000 fandom often treats the Necrontyr lore as backstory, the necessary context explaining why the Necrons exist in their current form. Interesting enough, but ultimately just prologue. Every fear we will examine today is the Necrontyr story continuing to unfold 60 million years later through the bodies and minds of beings who can still remember, or rather, who can almost remember, who can feel the shape of a memory they cannot quite access. The lives they had before the bio-furnaces consumed them. The Necrontyr lived in the Halo Stars region, far out in the galaxy's outer reaches, and their lives were defined by suffering in the most immediate biological sense. Their home star was a merciless radiator of ionizing energy. It bathed their world in constant radiation that penetrated everything except the deepest shelters. And the result was a species whose bodies were riddled with cancers from birth. Their lifespans were brutally short. Their deaths were rarely peaceful. They spent their brief existences in bodies that were already being consumed by their own biology, and they could not escape this because the radiation lived in their sun, the sun that lit every day and warmed every field, and whose light their civilization depended on. Think about what generations of this does to a culture. What it does to your philosophy, your art, your religion, your relationship with the concept of time. When life is reliably short and reliably painful, and when you are intelligent enough to understand exactly why it is those things, the obsession with death and its avoidance becomes not a morbid quirk, but the organizing principle of civilization. The Necrontyr built their cities literally in the shadow of their dead. Their sepulchres and tomb complexes were the permanent structures. The houses of the living were considered temporary because the living were temporary. The dead would outlast them. The dead already had. When the Necrontyr developed spaceflight and began exploring the galaxy, they took this psychology with them. And what they found in the galaxy made everything worse. They found the Old Ones. The Old Ones were to the galaxy what the Necrontyr might have dreamed of being in their most ambitious fantasies. Ancient beyond any mortal reckoning, effectively immortal, masters of the warp in ways that made the fabric of space and time an instrument rather than a constraint. They had been shaping galactic development since before the Necrontyr had developed language. They moved through dimensions the Necrontyr didn't even know existed, and they appeared to the radiation-sick, cancer-ridden, short-lived Necrontyr who encountered them as living proof that the universe could be otherwise, that the suffering built into every Necrontyr life was not fundamental but contingent, that things could be different. So the Necrontyr approached the Old Ones and essentially said, "You have the secret of immortality. You have what we need to not spend our lives dying. Please share it." The Old Ones said no. The exact reasons are not definitively known. Maybe they looked at the Necrontyr, a species defined by their awareness of mortality and their bitter resentment of anything that didn't share it, and made a reasonable assessment that giving eternity to beings already shaped by that kind of anger would produce nothing good. Maybe they were simply arrogant in the specific way that the very long-lived tend to become arrogant, disconnected from urgency, from the weight of limited time, from the visceral knowledge that every day matters when you don't have many left. Maybe they had reasons operating on scales the Necrontyr couldn't begin to access. Whatever the reason, the refusal ignited a war. The Necrontyr went to war with the Old Ones, a war they could not win by any reasonable strategic assessment. A war driven by wounded pride and burning resentment more than by any coherent plan. And as expected, they lost. The Old Ones had cultivated allies and servants across the galaxy, entire species uplifted and shaped, and given unique abilities specifically for moments like this. The Necrontyre, for all their brilliance and their fury, were outclassed. But they didn't stop. The war continued and became the backdrop against which everything else we're discussing today took place. This is when the Satan entered the story. There were things in the stars, vast entities of pure energy, born in the earliest moments of the universe when the first stars formed, growing slowly aware over billions of years as they fed on stellar radiation. The Satan, the star gods, in Necrontyre language, were not conscious in the way mortal beings are conscious, not initially. They were more like forces of nature that had developed the capacity for hunger and preference. Or they had existed since before any planet in the galaxy had cooled enough to support solid matter, and they had spent all that time feeding on the energy of suns, spreading across stellar surfaces and drinking deep of the nuclear fires. The Necrontyre discovered one of them feeding on their own sun. The Nightbringer, Azagorod, was already there, already feasting on the radiation that was destroying them when they first made contact with it. And through a combination of extraordinary courage, extraordinary desperation, and extraordinary foolishness, they built it a body of living metal, necrodermis, capable of containing its vast energetic form in a shell that could interact with the physical world in more directed ways. They gave a star vampire a face and hands and a voice. The Nightbringer, newly embodied, immediately began killing them. It had discovered that mortal life energy tasted considerably better than stellar radiation, and the beings who had just handed it a body full of potential were right there. The Necrontyre managed to stop the immediate massacre only by pledging their service and redirecting the Nightbringer's attention toward the galaxy's other, more numerous populations of potential prey. More Catan were awakened and embodied. More of these ancient, alien, power-hungry beings were brought into the Necrontyre's war. And then the most intelligent and cunning of them all, Mephetron, the Deceiver, made an offer. Immortality, real, physical immortality, embodied in living metal like the Satan's own forms. Not the frail biological immortality the Old Ones possessed, with all its dependencies on food and atmosphere and careful living, but mechanical immortality. Bodies that could not be consumed by radiation, could not develop cancer, could not simply fail through the 1,000 natural shocks that biological flesh is heir to. Transfer your consciousness into living metal. Live forever. Never fear death again. The Triarch, the Necrontyre's ruling council, debated this offer for a full year. In the entire council, one voice spoke against it. Orican the Diviner, the court astromancer, who apparently saw something in his astronomical calculations that convinced him this was catastrophic. He was outvoted. The enthusiasm of an entire civilization desperate for relief from mortality was not going to be held back by one mathematician's reading of the stars. The biofurnaces were built, where they roared day and night. Into them went the Necrontyre, some willingly, some not, some having their limbs broken and being carried to the furnaces by ghost arcs when they resisted, and out the other side came something new. The living metal bodies were perfect. The consciousness was transferred. The mortality that had defined every Necrontyre life was eliminated. But the Deceiver had not told them what the Satan were doing while this was happening. Above the biofurnaces, in their ethereal true forms, the Satan circled in vast numbers. They had waited for this moment. Biotransference was not merely a gift of immortality, it was the most efficient soul-harvesting operation ever conceived. Billions of Necrontyre, simultaneously releasing their spiritual essence as their consciousness jumped from biological matter to living metal. And all of that spiritual energy flowing directly into the waiting mouths of the star gods who had designed the process specifically to produce this result. When the silent King Zarek emerged from the biotransference and looked at what had happened to his people, He understood everything at once. The bodies were perfect. The bodies were magnificent. The bodies would endure through the death of stars. But the people inside them were no longer fully people. The lower castes, the farmers and craftspeople and soldiers, the vast ordinary bulk of Necron-tier civilization, had been reduced to barely aware automatons. Their individual consciousness had been consumed so thoroughly that only the most basic behavioral programming remained. They could follow orders, they could fight, they could exist, they could not think, or feel, or remember, or care. They were, in the most desolate sense, present but not there. The nobility and the specialized classes, the overlords, the cryptex, the praetorians, had been given bodies with more cognitive complexity, because complex minds made for more capable officers and specialists. They retained something closer to personhood, but they had still lost their souls. The spiritual substance that connected them to the warp, that gave their lives resonance in the cosmological sense, that allowed them to fully feel and fully experience and fully be, gone, eaten, digested, gone. Sarek led his people to victory over the Old Ones anyway. He had committed too fully to turn back, and the war still needed winning. And then, when the Citan were at their most vulnerable, gorged on their victory, distracted by the end of the war, and not yet vigilant against the possibility of betrayal from beings they had just helped, he gathered his weapons and his warriors, and he shattered the gods. The god-killing weapons the Necrons used in the revolt against the Citan were so powerful that using them damaged causality itself. The Silent King had to remove the knowledge of these weapons from his warriors afterward, because he was afraid of what they might do with that capability. The Citan were impossible to fully destroy. They were part of the fundamental fabric of reality, and reality could not entirely unmake itself. So each was instead sundered into thousands of smaller fragments, each one still carrying the full personality of the original being, but reduced in raw destructive capability. Each shard was sealed in a tesseract labyrinth, a multi-dimensional prison of Necron engineering, and the collection was catalogued and maintained. And then Sarek put his people to sleep. The Great Sleep, 60 million years of stasis, while the galaxy aged around them, and the civilizations of the Old Ones' creation rose and fell, and rose again, and built their empires in the abandoned property of the Necrons. He did not sleep with them. He could not face them. Instead, he destroyed the command protocols that gave him control over his people, severing the mechanism of his power over their minds, and he walked alone into the void between galaxies to find whatever combination of solace and penance the darkness of intergalactic space could offer. This is the foundation. This is the beginning of every fear the Necrons carry. Now let's examine them one by one, because each one matters. Part 2. The theft that cannot be undone. Fear of permanent soullessness. There is a specific kind of grief that doesn't howl. It doesn't thrash and collapse. It sits in the back of a room, quiet and permanent, present in every moment of apparent normalcy, impossible to fully forget, because it is not a memory of something lost, but the continuous experience of an absence that is always current. This is the grief of a being who knows precisely what was taken, understands exactly how it was taken, has had 60 million years to think about it from every possible angle, and cannot find any argument that makes it bearable. The absence of a soul in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is not a metaphorical condition. It is a specific, measurable state. The warp is the mirror dimension that reflects all mortal consciousness and emotion and spiritual experience. It is built from these things, sustained by them, shaped by their currents and tides. Every being with a soul projects into the warp. Their presence there is real, substantive, consequential. It's what makes their consciousness resonate in the full cosmological sense. It is what the chaos gods feed on. It is the medium through which psychers perform their art. It is the pathway to whatever afterlife might exist for a given species. It is the thing that makes a life more than just a biological process running toward its endpoint. the Satan consumed the Necrontiers' souls in the biotransference, ate them, digested them, used them as fuel for divine appetites. What remained in the living metal bodies was less than the original. Personality engrams, behavioral architectures, memory traces, the compressed and diminished residue of what used to be a full person. For the warrior castes and lower nobility, this residue barely constitutes selfhood. For the higher nobles, who were given more sophisticated cognitive machinery, it is more substantial, but it is still the shadow of what it replaced. When you think about what it means to live without a soul in this specific cosmological sense, the particular quality of Necron existence becomes clearer. The rich inner life that makes consciousness feel like more than just processing. The capacity for genuine joy, for the kind of love that changes you. As for the aesthetic resonance that makes beauty feel important, rather than just visually pleasant. These are diminished or absent. Not because the Necrons lack intelligence. They are enormously intelligent. Orican the Diviner runs astronomical calculations that bend time. Trazyn the Infinite manages a historical archive of incomprehensible scope and detail. Imhotep the Stormlord executes military campaigns of strategic brilliance across multiple systems simultaneously. But intelligence without soul is a different thing than intelligence with soul, and the difference shows in specific telling ways. The Necrons do not laugh. Not really. Not with the spontaneous delight that laughter expresses. They do not grieve in the way that grief moves through a full person, that cleanses something even as it hurts. They do not fall in love, or feel the specific warmth of deep friendship, or experience wonder in ways that leave them changed. What they have at their best are approximations. The obsessive collector Trazyn finds something that resembles satisfaction in his acquisitions. Orican finds something that resembles intellectual pleasure in his calculations. These are not nothing, but they are pale compared to what the full experience of consciousness with soul provides. And the Necrons, who are aware enough to recognize this, know it for the diminishment it is. There is also the question of the afterlife, or rather, its complete absence for Necrons. When a mortal being with a soul dies in the 40,000 universe, their consciousness passes into the warp. What happens there varies by species and circumstance. Some are drawn to the chaos gods, and some are claimed by psychopomps and gods specific to their culture. Some simply dissolve into the currents of the Sea of Souls. But there is a somewhere to go. The soul survives the death of the body, at least briefly, at least potentially. For the Necrons, there is no such exit. When a Necron's organic components finally fail, when the last traces of biological material within the necrodermis cease to function, there is simply nothing. The personality engrams and memory traces that constituted selfhood have nowhere to go. The warp does not receive them because there is nothing of them that is warp compatible. They end completely. The immortality that was purchased in the biofurnaces is not the immortality the Necrontyre imagined. It is mechanical continuity. The body endures, the programming persists, but the patterns of behavior and preference that constitute the closest approximation of selfhood that remains will continue until the physical substrate is destroyed. But it is not a self that will continue to grow or deepen or find new dimensions of experience. It is a self that will continue, and that's all. 60 million years of this. 60 million years of continuing. Some Necrons have found frameworks for this that work, at least functionally. Trazyn's obsessive collection, Orican's temporal mathematics, the warriors who find a kind of meaning in the campaigns and the battles and the reclamation of territory that was once theirs. These are genuine adaptive strategies, and the intelligence the Necrons possess means they can construct those strategies with real sophistication. But the framework is always visible, was always clearly an artifact of necessity rather than organic purpose. The fear here is not of a future catastrophe. The fear is of the present condition being all there is, of this being what they are and what they will always be, and of no amount of strategic success changing the fundamental quality of what it feels like, what it fails to feel like. to be a Necron. Part 3. The Gods in the Bottle. The Catan Shards and the Risk of Their Liberation. Consider the actual logistics of what the Necrons do with the shattered remains of their former gods. Each Catan was broken into thousands of shards during the Necron Revolt. Each shard retains the full personality and intelligence of the original being, and each shard has been imprisoned in a tesseract labyrinth, a multidimensional containment device that prevents the shard from simply using its raw cosmic power to break free. And the Necrons maintain and transport these prisons. They carry them on their vessels. They bring them to battle sites. And when the tactical situation becomes sufficiently desperate, when nothing else in the Necron arsenal will turn the tide, they open a prison and direct the rage of an imprisoned god at the enemy. This is a situation that should make any sentient being deeply uncomfortable, and the Necrons, who understand better than anyone what they are handling, experience something very much like constant background dread about it. The Catan Shards are not diminished in their motivations. Imprisonment has not reduced their capacity for resentment, or their patience, or their intelligence. They know exactly what was done to them. They know who did it. They know they are being used as weapons by the beings who betrayed them. And they wait, with the patience of entities who were old before any star in the current galaxy was born, for the opportunity that will present itself sooner or later. The Nightbringer's shards are the most consistently described as dangerous to handle. This is partly because the Nightbringer was, among the Catan, the most directly destructive, the one that found the greatest joy in the simple act of killing and the consumption of life energies released in pain and terror. Its shards do not want to be pointed at specific targets and then recalled. They want to continue. They want more. Or containing a battle-active Nightbringer shard, before it has finished killing everything in range, requires measures that themselves carry risk. But the Nightbringer's shards are dangerous in another way that goes beyond tactical management. This is the Catan that deliberately planted its image as the personification of death in the racial memory of every sapient species in the galaxy that was old enough to receive the impression. The hooded figure, the scythe, the patient inevitability, the Grim Reaper, as humans would come to call it, the Aeldari's Kalis Ra, destroyer of light. Every civilization's mythological death figure traces back to this one act of psychic mass imprinting performed by a being that is now in a box that the Necrons carry around. The Nightbringer knew what it was doing when it seeded that image. It was farming fear, creating a galaxy-spanning psychological dependency on the concept it represented, feeding from the ambient terror of billions of beings who carried its image as their deepest understanding of mortality. Even shattered and imprisoned, the Nightbringer's influence persists in the psychology of every species that received its imprinting, which is essentially all of them. The shards feed on this residual fear, and being the specific focus of that species-wide terror makes them harder to control than a straightforwardly powerful entity would be, because they are not merely powerful, they are also resonant with the deepest anxieties of every mind they encounter. The Deceiver's shards represent a different quality of threat. This is the Catan that talked an entire civilization into destroying itself. Or that manufactured an entire false resistance movement. Nephreth the Untouched, the supposedly cancer-free Pharaon who gave hope to Necrontyre, who opposed biotransference, and revealed at the critical moment that Nephreth was one of its own cast-off shards, a puppet designed to identify and then crush all dissent simultaneously. The Deceiver is, in the cosmic sense, the galaxy's most accomplished liar. Its shards retain this quality. They manipulate, they suggest, they arrange for their wielders to make decisions that serve the shard's interests while believing those decisions are their own. A Necron overlord who deploys the Deceiver shard must wonder, at some level, whether the strategic insight that made deployment seem like a good idea in the first place was something they arrived at independently, or whether the shard, sitting in its tesseract labyrinth, patient and cunning, with full access to the intellectual capabilities of the original Deceiver, had somehow been influencing the decision-making process from within its prison. This is not a comforting question to sit with. The risk of Satan shard liberation is documented in the lore with specific examples. A shard of the Void Dragon that was being studied by cryptex of the Aratepk dynasty escaped containment in 912 M41. This was a comparatively minor shard, a fragment of a fragment. It destroyed the entire Aratepk dynasty. Then it consumed 12 worlds. Then, after significant effort by the surviving cryptex, it was re-imprisoned. Those are the stakes for a minor shard with partial power. The worst-case scenario is the reassembly of a full Satan from its distributed shards. Well, the Necrons monitor the locations of all shards constantly, maintaining separation between shards of the same original entity, specifically to prevent the accumulation that would allow for reassembly. A sufficiently powerful Satan shard can absorb other shards if proximity and opportunity align. This is what the lore calls a transcendent shard, and managing such a shard requires a level of caution that goes well beyond the already significant caution applied to standard containment. A fully reassembled Satan would be back to something approaching its pre-shattering power level, and the weapons used to shatter the Satan the first time are either destroyed or so deeply buried in the Silent King's private history that they may as well not exist. Back Part 4. The Curse from Beyond Obliteration. Fear of the Flayer Virus. There is one Catan that the Necrons did not merely shatter, they destroyed it, completely as the laws of the 40,000 universe allow for the destruction of an entity that is part of the fundamental fabric of reality. They brought everything they had against Yandagor, the Flayer, in the final days of their revolt, and what came out the other side was nothing. Not shards, not fragments, nothing. And in the moment of its annihilation, Yandagor did something that the Necrons are still living with today, millions of years later, in a way that has no end in sight. It cursed them. The Flayer's final words, preserved in lore through the documentation of subsequent events, rather than any direct account of who was there to hear them, and read as something close to a death proclamation. A god turning its destruction into a weapon aimed at the civilization that destroyed it. The curse was embedded in Necron living metal, in the necrodermis itself, in the material that constitutes the bodies of every Necron who exists. A slow poison, a sleeping infection, a thing that waited. The Flayer virus, also called the Flayer curse or the longing sickness in some of the more poetic texts, is a condition that begins subtly and ends in a place that the intact Necron mind finds genuinely horrifying. Its early stages are almost impossible to distinguish from normal Necron behavioral variation. A warrior that is slightly more aggressive than standard parameters. A nobleman with a slightly elevated interest in casualties. While a cryptech whose experiments have become more preoccupied with organic matter than before. In a civilization of beings who are all, to varying degrees, managing the psychological weight of hollow immortality, a small behavioral drift is easy to miss. Then it intensifies. The drive to kill goes beyond tactical necessity. Commands to hold position are processed but not followed. The infected Necron pursues enemies long past any strategic value in doing so, continuing the slaughter as a compulsion rather than a military action. This phase can last for some time before the more distinctive markers of the condition become visible. And then comes the hunger. A robotic being, without organic systems of any kind, without a stomach or a digestive tract or any biological mechanism for consuming matter, begins to crave flesh. Not abstractly. Not metaphorically. The hunger comes with the full force of a biological drive in a body that cannot satisfy it. The infected Necron is drawn to organic matter with an urgency that overrides other functions. It begins to take flesh from its kills, to press it against its metal face as if it could absorb it by contact, to wrap itself in the skins and tissues of its victims in a doomed attempt to satisfy something that the body it inhabits has no mechanism to satisfy. The living metal of the necrodermis accommodates this compulsion. It warps. It reshapes. It grows claws specifically suited to the efficient removal of skin, long curved blades of living metal designed for flaying. The face, which in standard Necrons carries the blank impassivity of metal, develops something. Not warmth, not life, but something that looks, horribly, like a mask made from the features of the dead it has collected. This is a flayed one, and the response from other Necrons when one is identified among their number is something between fear and revulsion that goes deeper than the tactical risk such a being represents. The Flayer virus spreads. Through contact with Necron living metal, potentially through mere proximity in some accounts, potentially through the mental state of the exposed Necron in others. Some cryptecs believe that a Necron psychologically on the edge, already worn down by the weight of hollow immortality, already close to the kind of despair that makes the Flayer's compulsive horror feel like a release, is more susceptible than a relatively stable individual. If this is true, the Flayer virus is not just an infection, but a predator that specifically seeks out the weak points in the psychology of a species that is, by its nature, full of weak points. The lore documents entire communities consumed. The Bone Kingdom of Drazak is an entire Necron realm populated entirely by flayed ones. Its ruler, the Flayer King Valgul, who retained enough of his original noble intellect to maintain a brutal order among his subjects. When the kingdom's flesh supply runs low, he issues what he calls a time of bounty and sends his people out into the galaxy. This is governance in Drazak. This is what passes for normal Necron social function in a community where the virus has won. There are records of the Flayer virus crossing species lines. Et Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests who were experimenting with samples of Necron living metal began manifesting symptoms. They started engaging in self-mutilation. They began worshipping Landugor, the Catan who died millions of years ago, whose curse was apparently still broadcasting loudly enough through the medium of infected metal to reach biological minds in the present day. A dead god cursed a civilization. The god is gone. The curse endures. Its spread continues through every Necron body in the galaxy, waiting in the metal, and no cryptech who has ever studied it has produced a cure. 60 million years, still spreading. Part 5. The Logic of the Abyss. Fear of the Destroyer Cult. The Flayer virus is terrifying because it is an infection from outside, something that was done to the Necrons by a dying god. The Destroyer Cult is terrifying for a more uncomfortable reason. It is not something done to them. It is something they do to themselves. It is the end point of their own psychology, arrived at through reasoning that, when you follow it carefully, makes a certain kind of terrible sense. Consider the actual conditions of Necron existence from the inside. You are in a body you did not choose, made of material you cannot change, permanently separated from the organic life that was the substrate of everything you once were. Your soul is gone, consumed by beings you subsequently had to destroy to stop them from consuming everything else. The memories of your organic life are fragmentary and possibly deliberately damaged. You cannot fully remember what was taken from you, only that something was. You have been awake and functioning for 60 million years, or you have been in stasis for 60 million years and have just awakened into a galaxy that has entirely moved on without you. You cannot have children. Your species has no new members being born. Every casualty in battle that is not fully recovered through reanimation protocols is a permanent reduction in your civilization's total population. You are watching your species slowly diminish, not through catastrophic warfare, but through the ordinary attrition of existence, and there is no mechanism to reverse this without solving the biotransference problem, which is the most difficult technical challenge in the history of your civilization, which has so far resisted 60 million years of the most brilliant minds your species has produced. And the organic experience that might make existence feel worth something is gone. Joy exists only as approximation. The emotional depth that makes relationships meaningful is attenuated almost to nothing for most Necrons. The rich inner life that makes consciousness something more than processing is diminished or absent. You can be effective. You can be strategically brilliant. You can win battles and reclaim territory and execute plans of extraordinary complexity. But all of this happens in a context where the experience of being alive feels like looking at a beautiful landscape through very thick glass. Now you have been awake for a very long time, and whatever psychological mechanisms were holding all of this in check have been slowly wearing down.
I want to stop here for just a second because I think this is the part of the lore that first made me genuinely care about the Necrons. Before I really sat with their history, I looked at them and saw exactly what they look like on the surface. Cold, ancient, powerful, unstoppable, the undead robot empire. And that's fine, that's a compelling aesthetic, but it felt distant, like watching a glacier move. What changed it for me was the biotransference, specifically the moment when Zarek comes out of the biofurnace and understands what he just agreed to. He got everything he asked for. He's immortal. His people are immortal. And standing there in a perfect metal body that will never get sick. He looks at what he has become and realizes he has been robbed. That's the thing that got me. Not the power or the regret. It's that specific, quiet, permanent regret of someone who made the only choice they thought they had, and will spend the rest of forever knowing exactly what it cost. And I think that's more interesting than any weapon system they have. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
The long sleep didn't help. It accelerated the organic degradation. Your memories are fuzzier. Your sense of who you were before all this is dimming. The already faint warmth of whatever passed for emotional life in your metal form is getting fainter. At what point does the logical conclusion become? None of this is worth preserving. This is the thought that produces destroyers. Not alien infection, not divine curse. A Necron that has followed the logic of its own situation to a conclusion that the logic supports and then made the choice, if choice is still the right word at that point, to act on it. The life it had was taken. The life it has now is hollow. Therefore, life is the problem, not the solution. Destroyers want to eliminate all biological life in the galaxy, not as a tactical objective, not as a means to some other end, as the end itself. Thus, they will sterilize worlds down to the bacterial level, boiling oceans with their weapons, burning every photosynthetic organism, eliminating every trace of biology from every world they visit. They will continue until there is nothing biological left in reach. And since they themselves are still among the living in the technical sense, they are not purely inorganic. They contain organic components in the cognitive portions of their necrodermis frames. Their logic eventually requires their own inclusion in the destruction. Other Necrons fear the destroyer cult for multiple reasons simultaneously. The first is straightforwardly tactical. An unconstrained destroyer force is a threat to every organic being in the galaxy, including the organic beings that many Necron dynasties consider a potential future resource for biotransference reversal. An overactive destroyer cult that eliminates the galaxy's biological populations before the technical capacity to reverse biotransference is achieved would eliminate the very resource that gives Necron civilization its long-term purpose. The second is more personal. The destroyer cult's madness is perceived by many Necrons as potentially contagious, not through viral mechanism, but through philosophical exposure. Spending time in proximity to destroyers, thinking carefully about their reasoning, considering whether they are wrong, there is a worry that this process can accelerate the same psychological deterioration in Necrons who are already vulnerable to it. The cults are treated as pariahs and tolerated for military utility, but kept at arm's length even by dynasties that deploy them. Destroyers are not commanded. They are pointed and released, and then recaptured if possible after the engagement. The third, the deepest reason, is the recognition. A Necron noble who is functioning and self-aware can trace the path that leads to becoming a destroyer, can find the point in the reasoning where it diverges from their own current position, and the divergence is often smaller than they would like to believe. The cliff is visible from where they stand. They can see that they are not at its edge. They cannot always be entirely confident about how far they are from it. There is one more dimension to the destroyer fear that rarely gets discussed, and it is this: the destroyers are not entirely wrong. And this is perhaps the most disturbing thing about them. The argument they have made, that hollow mechanical existence extending indefinitely into a future that offers no genuine improvement, is not worth preserving for its own sake, is not an obviously bad argument. The Necrons who are still functional and self-aware and pursuing the dream of biotransference reversal are not refuting the destroyer argument. They are choosing not to follow it to its conclusion. That choice requires an ongoing act of will, a continuous commitment to the possibility that things can be different, that the dream of organic restoration is real and achievable and worth the cost of continuing. An acts of will performed by beings whose organic components are slowly degrading, whose cognitive architecture is slowly eroding, whose sense of what is meaningful is slowly narrowing. These acts of will become harder to sustain over geological timescales. The destroyers are the beings who stopped performing that act of will. Looking at them, the functioning Necrons understand that they are looking at what they could become if they stopped. The fear is not abstract. It is immediate, continuous, and inescapable. Part 6. The galaxy-sized mouth. Fear of the Tyranid hive fleets. There is a threat that made the Silent King end his exile. Think about what it took. 60 million years of solitary travel through the void between galaxies. 60 million years of carrying the weight of what he did to his people. He had left specifically because he could not face what he had caused, had destroyed his own command protocols to sever his authority over them. Ed had put light years of empty void between himself and the evidence of the worst decision in Necrontire history. The scale of the self-imposed exile corresponds to the scale of the guilt. A lesser being's penance lasts a lifetime. Sarek's lasted through geological epochs. Something had to be significant enough to override that. The Tyranids were significant enough. In the void between galaxies, the Silent King encountered the leading edges of the Tyranid invasion force. He recognized what they were immediately, what they meant, what they intended, what would happen to the galaxy if they were allowed to operate without coordinated opposition. And he turned around and came back. The reasoning is precise. The Necrons' ultimate goal, the project that gives their entire civilization purpose, and that stands between the functional portion of their society and the destroyer cult endpoint of their despair, is the reversal of biotransference, the return to organic bodies, the undoing of the trade made in the biofurnaces. This goal requires that when the technical capacity for reversal is finally achieved, there will still exist organic life of sufficient biological complexity to serve as host bodies for Necron consciousness. Tyranids consume all organic life. Every hive fleet that completes its consumption of a world leaves that world stripped to geological stone. No organisms, no atmosphere, no soil biology, nothing that could serve as a host for anyone's consciousness, ever, because there is nothing left. The Tyranids do not merely defeat the population of a world, or they consume the world's entire biological capacity, and they are still coming. The hive fleets that have reached the galaxy, Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and the others, each one a catastrophic invasion in its own right, are described consistently in the lore as the advance elements, the scouts, the leading tendrils of a main force that is still traveling through the intergalactic void. What the galaxy has been experiencing and suffering through is the preliminary probing action. The main Tyranid invasion has not yet arrived. The hive mind learns. This is perhaps the most strategically relevant fact about the Tyranids from the Necrons' perspective. Every engagement the hive mind survives produces biological data that gets incorporated into new bioform designs, new tactical approaches, new organism types specifically engineered to address whatever presented problems in previous encounters. A Tyranid swarm that has fought Necron forces before is not the same swarm. It has adapted. The reanimation protocols that allowed downed Necrons to rise and continue fighting have been studied. Subsequent Tyranid designs deploy organisms capable of destroying Necron components thoroughly enough to prevent phase-out recovery. The Gauss weapons that strip atoms from targets layer by layer have been analyzed. Subsequent Tyranid organisms are sent in volumes that overwhelm the attrition-based firing cadence. The Necrons have advantages. Their technology is extraordinary. Their reanimation capability, while not infinite, makes their forces significantly more resilient than organic armies. Their dolmen gates allow warp-independent travel that remains functional even in the shadow in the warp that Tyranid hive fleets project, which disrupts warp navigation for everyone else trying to respond to Tyranid incursions. Their weapons include effects that are not biological in nature, and therefore not straightforwardly adaptable against. Antimatter weaponry operates on laws of physics that organisms cannot evolve immunity to. But the numbers are not comforting. The total biomass the Tyranid main fleet represents is staggering in scale. The Necrons cannot grow their own numbers to compensate for attrition, while the Tyranids can and do. Every world consumed provides more material for the production of new bioforms. The long-term attrition dynamics favor the side that can replace its losses indefinitely. As the Silent King fights this threat with everything available to him, he works through unwitting agents, through alliances with organic races he does not respect, through manipulation and calculated intervention. He has no interest in saving those organic races for their own sake. He is saving the biosphere they inhabit, because that biosphere is what he needs to exist in any form worth calling existence. Part 7. The Open Wound in the Sky. Fear of Chaos and the Great Rift. The Necrons are soulless. They project nothing into the warp. Chaos cannot corrupt them in the ways it corrupts organic beings. Demons have difficulty perceiving them. The emotional resonance that chaos gods feed on is absent from Necron existence, in the same way that color is absent from a room with no light. And yet the Necrons fear chaos. The Silent King views the chaos threat as one of the two primary existential concerns for his species' future, alongside the Tyranids. The apparent paradox resolves when you understand the distinction between chaos as a tactical threat and chaos as an existential threat. Individual demonic incursions, individual possession attempts, individual psychic attacks. These are tactical concerns that the Necron's soullessness renders largely irrelevant. But chaos as a cosmological force is aiming at something else entirely. The chaos gods, at their most fundamental level of motivation, want the warp to consume real space. They want the boundary between the immaterium and the material universe to erode completely, but for the realm of pure psychic energy and emotion to flood into physical reality and transform it into something continuous with the warp. This is what a chaos victory would actually look like. Not the defeat of a specific army, but the dissolution of the barrier that separates two fundamentally different kinds of existence. For the Necrons, this is not a matter of corruption or conversion. They cannot be corrupted by chaos, but they can be eliminated by the disappearance of the universe they inhabit. If real space dissolves into the warp, there is nowhere for material beings to be. The Necrons' mechanical forms would not survive the transformation of the substrate they exist in. They would be erased, not by weapons, but by the elimination of the medium of their existence. This is why the Necrons maintained blackstone pylons on Cardia and across other strategic locations in the galaxy. The pylons were not a recent construction. They were built millions of years ago, seeded across specific points in the galaxy as part of a long-term defensive infrastructure designed to suppress warp activity and maintain the stability of real space. Cadia's pylons specifically had been functioning as a stabilizing influence around the Eye of Terror for millennia. Their effect was partial. They couldn't close the eye, but they prevented its expansion and reduced the frequency and intensity of demonic incursion in the surrounding regions. When Abaddon destroyed those pylons during the 13th Black Crusade, the catastrophic result was the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, a wound in reality running half the length of the galaxy, through which the warp bleeds continuously into physical space. The galaxy effectively split in two. Those systems on the far side of the rift from Terra became the Dark Imperium, cut off and increasingly unreachable, the Astronomican's light unable to penetrate the warp turbulence. Warp storms became more frequent and more severe across all regions. The fabric of space-time became less reliable everywhere. From the Necrons' perspective, this was not simply an Imperial problem. It was the loss of a significant piece of their defensive infrastructure, built over millions of years, protecting a stability they depended on. It was also confirmation that the chaos threat was accelerating. First, that the timeline for their galaxy-spanning Pariah Nexus project was tighter than they would have preferred. The Pariah Nexus project is Zarek's answer to the chaos threat, and it is simultaneously one of the most ambitious plans in the 40k setting, and one of the most disruptive to every other faction's interests. By deploying massive arrays of negatively polarized noctilith pylons across interstellar regions, creating interlocking fields that suppress warp activity over progressively larger volumes of space, he is working toward a network that would eventually blanket the entire galaxy in a barrier between real space and the Imperium. A completed Pariah Nexus would not selectively suppress chaos while leaving everything else intact. It would suppress all warp-based capabilities. Warp travel would become impossible or severely impaired. Astropathic communication would fail. Psychic powers would be weakened or eliminated across the affected regions. Demonic manifestation would be suppressed. The Aeldari's webway would be affected. The Tyrannid shadow in the warp would also be disrupted, which gives the project an argument for being useful against the Tyrannid threat as well. The Necrons have made their calculations and have concluded that this is the appropriate response to the chaos threat, consequences to other civilizations notwithstanding. This is not callousness exactly. It is the logic of beings who are genuinely afraid of the dissolution of reality and are willing to accept significant collateral effects to address that fear. What makes the Pariah Nexus project particularly interesting as a piece of lore is what it reveals about how the Necrons prioritize their fears. They are building a system that will, if completed, drastically reduce the quality of life for every warp-dependent civilization in the galaxy. It will make the Imperium of man's communications network non-functional across large regions. It will deprive the Eldari of psychic capabilities they have relied on for their species' survival. It will affect the Tau's spiritual practices and their limited but real connection to the warp. It will change the galaxy's entire psychic landscape. The Necrons know this. They have assessed this. And their assessment is that preventing the chaos threat from dissolving physical reality is worth these costs. Yet because the dissolution of physical reality is an outcome from which there is no recovery, whereas the disruption of warp-based civilization is an outcome that the organic races can potentially adapt to over time. This is a ruthlessly utilitarian calculation made by beings who have been doing long-term strategic planning for longer than any other current civilization has existed, and it is consistent with every other decision the Necrons have made. It is also deeply unsettling, because it demonstrates that the Necrons' fear of chaos is large enough to justify imposing enormous costs on everyone else in the galaxy without consultation or consent. The fear drives the plan. The plan imposes consequences. The consequences shape everyone's future. That is Necron geopolitics in the current era. And it flows entirely from the fear of a dissolution of reality, that the Necrons, as material beings with no warp presence, cannot survive. Part 8. The Madman Who Cannot Be Caged. Fear of Zaranoga, the Outsider. Among the Xatan that the Necrons were able to shatter and contain, there is one that stands conspicuously outside the system. One that is not in a Tesseract labyrinth, somewhere in a Necron vault. One that is not being deployed as a battlefield weapon by any dynasty. One that is simply elsewhere, outside the galaxy, outside the containment protocols, outside the reach of everything the Necrons built to manage the divine threats they created when they freed the Satan from their stars. Zaranoga, the Outsider. The Outsider's descent into madness began with the Laughing God. Segorach, the Aeldari Harlequin deity, performed a manipulation of extraordinary scale during the war in heaven. Through elaborate deception, the details vary between sources. Segorach caused the Outsider to mistake other Catan for enemies and consume them. The Outsider devoured its brethren, absorbing their divine energy. the absorption did not go as it was supposed to. The consumed Catan did not simply integrate into the outsider's consciousness, enriching it and expanding its power. Instead, fragments of each consumed deity's personality remained distinct. Separate voices, separate presences, separate streams of divine consciousness living inside the outsider's mind simultaneously. A chorus of ingested gods, each one screaming, each one adding its particular madness to the host that was struggling to process what it had eaten. The outsider was driven insane, yet what emerged was a being that the Necrons found completely outside the scope of their protocols. Not because it was too powerful to fight, the Necrons had the god-killing weapons and had used them, but because its madness had fundamentally changed the nature of the challenge it represented. Its presence alone caused catastrophic psychological failure in any being that came close to it. Warriors who maintained enough coherence to understand what was happening chose to end their lives, rather than continue to endure it. The madness radiated from the outsider like heat from a fire, but the heat was existential rather than thermal. It reached into minds and undid the architecture that made cognition possible. What does it mean for an entity to radiate insanity? In the 40,000 universe, where the warp reflects and amplifies mortal consciousness, a being whose inner state is absolute divine madness would project that state outward in ways that affect the reality around it. The outsider is not merely insane. It is a divine being whose insanity has become a property of the space it occupies. Coming close to the outsider means entering a region where reality has been distorted by the presence of a god who has lost all coherence, where the normal laws that govern how minds process their environment have been overwritten by something that does not function according to those laws. It is less like encountering a mad entity and more like stepping into a region where madness is the ambient condition. According to the Book of Mournful Night, the Necrons' own accounting of the revolt against the Satan, the outsider became too terrible to defeat. Its terror was too profound to endure for the time necessary to complete the defeat. Some accounts say it destroyed itself through its own internal contradictions. Other accounts, preserved in Eldari archives and described in hints throughout the lore, say it is the one Satan that was never imprisoned, the only fully intact star god still in existence, the one case where the Necron protocols failed entirely. According to the Book of Mournful Night, the outsider became, through this transformation, too terrible to defeat. Some accounts say it destroyed itself through its own internal contradictions. Others say it is the one Satan that was never imprisoned, that no prison ever held it, that it is potentially the last fully intact Satan in existence. What all accounts agree on is where it went. As the outsider retreated from the populated regions of the galaxy and established itself in a hollow world, a Dyson sphere of its own construction, located far below the galactic plane in the empty dark spaces outside the main body of the Milky Way galaxy. And it has been there, possibly for millions of years, possibly since the war in heaven, sitting in its hollow prison that it built for itself, fighting the chorus of consumed gods in its mind, feeding on whatever stellar energy drifts to that remote location. The hints about the outsider's current status are few, but significant. Hive Fleet Leviathan, one of the most aggressive and capable Tyranid invasions on record, altered its course during its approach to avoid the region where the outsider resides. The Tyranid hive mind, which does not experience fear in any conventional sense, but which treats every obstacle as a resource allocation problem to be solved, decided that the outsider warranted avoidance rather than engagement. A hive fleet changed its direction for the outsider in a way it has not done for anything else in the recorded history of Tyranid incursions. Imperial Navy personnel who have accidentally ventured into the outer galactic regions near the outsider's position have filed reports describing experiences that defy rational comprehension. Inverted geometries, spatial relationships that should not exist, an ambient despair so complete and so irresistible that it stripped away the will to continue functioning. The reports of the survivors, when read carefully, describe psychological damage consistent with prolonged exposure to the outsider's distinctive form of madness at a distance. For the Necrons, as the outsider is the case that proves their containment systems are not absolute, they shattered and imprisoned the others. The outsider sits outside their reach, outside their governance, outside their knowledge of its current state or intentions. And ancient Eldari prophecies that the farseers of their craft worlds maintain carefully describe a future in which the outsider returns. One dark night, it shall come back. The exile is not permanent. Whatever the outsider is resolving in its hollow world at the galaxy's edge, the resolution will eventually conclude. What happens after that conclusion is not specified in any prophecy that has been preserved. At Part 9, The Dragon Beneath Mars. Fear of a god sleeping in an enemy's basement. There is a location in the heart of the Imperium of Man that the Necrons have conducted suicide missions to monitor. 5 Necron Shroud-class light cruisers ran suicide attack vectors directly into the Mars defense grid in 998 M41. They did not have a conventional military objective. The Sol system's defenses would destroy them before they could accomplish any conventional strategic goal. And 5 ships is an insufficient force to achieve any territorial objective against the most heavily defended system in the Imperium anyway. The only interpretation that makes operational sense is reconnaissance, a one-way mission to gather intelligence about something on Mars, something worth 5 warships. What is on Mars is Magladroth, the Void Dragon. Or more precisely, what is beneath Mars, in the geological formations called the Noctis Labyrinth, is a Cetan shard of Magladroth, possibly a large one, possibly the largest fragment of the Void Dragon that survived the Necron revolt and the subsequent shattering. The Void Dragon is described in Eldari mythology, which has reason to know more about the Cetan than most sources, as the most powerful and terrible of the star gods. Its domain is the material realm itself, technology, physical matter, the laws that govern how things are made and unmade. During the War in Heaven, the Void Dragon's warriors were so formidable that the Old Ones created the Blackstone fortresses specifically to combat them. These weapons, enormous orbital constructs powered by the souls of Eldari seers, represent some of the most powerful anti-Cetan technology ever deployed, and they were built specifically because nothing else was sufficient against Magladroth's forces. The Void Dragon conceived the Blackstone pylon technology. It designed the instruments that suppress the warp. It is the intelligence behind the Necrons' most fundamental technological infrastructure in ways that may go deeper than the Necrons themselves currently understand. When the revolt came and the shattering was performed, the Void Dragon was broken and imprisoned like the others. But one shard came to Mars, and before the Emperor had a name or an Imperium to give that name to, he fought it. He could not kill it. The Emperor of mankind, at the height of his power, a being who had been cultivating his capabilities for 10,000 years, whose raw psychic force was unprecedented in human history, brought everything he had against the Void Dragon shard and could not destroy it. He could only imprison it. So he sealed it beneath Mars, in a Necron-built stasis tomb that had apparently been prepared in advance, and then he left it there. The passive influence of the imprisoned shard has been shaping Martian civilization ever since. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests who form the Imperium's industrial backbone, who worship technology as religion, who pursue the augmentation of their own bodies with mechanical components as a form of spiritual practice, emerged from a culture that had been unconsciously absorbing the Void Dragon's whispered influence for thousands of years. The machine god they revere, the belief that flesh is weak and metal is pure, the sacred reverence for machines and the knowledge of their operation. These are the downstream effects of a Cetan of technology, sleeping beneath their planet, seeping its nature through sealed stone and into the culture that built itself above it. The Necron's suicide mission in 998 M41 was about assessing the status of this shard. Is it still contained? Is the stasis holding? Has the Emperor's imprisonment maintained its integrity, despite the fact that the Emperor has been immobile on the Golden Throne for 10,000 years? Has his active power reduced from whatever it once was? The answers to these questions are not publicly known, even within Necron's strategic planning. What is known is that the Void Dragon Shard that escaped containment in the Aratep dynasty's possession destroyed an entire dynasty in 12 worlds, and the shard beneath Mars is significantly larger than whatever the Aratep dynasty was studying. If it wakes up, if the containment fails, if the Imperium's defenses cannot hold it, if the Emperor's imprisonment unravels, the consequences are not estimable in advance with any confidence. Part 10. The Long Dark Inside. Fear of their own minds, dissolving. Everything we have examined so far involves external threats. The Tyranids, the Satan, the Destroyer cult's madness, the Chaos Gods, the Outsider, the Void Dragons sleeping under Mars. And each one is a genuine and serious concern. But there is a fear that lives inside each Necron who is still aware enough to have it. A fear that is more intimate and in some ways more immediately terrible than any external threat. The fear of losing themselves. The Necron's consciousness lives in organic matter embedded within their necrodermis frames. The living metal is essentially indestructible under normal conditions. It can regenerate from almost any damage, can reassemble from scattered components, can maintain its structure through the death of stars given sufficient time. But the organic components, the brain tissue, the neural architecture, the biological systems that make genuine personality and continuous memory possible, are not indestructible. They degrade, slowly, on timescales that make geological processes feel hasty, but consistently and without any mechanism of repair that Necron science has successfully developed. Every period spent in the Great Sleep accelerates this degradation. The long stasis periods reduce the active cellular processes that would otherwise maintain the organic components, allowing subtle entropic processes to accumulate undisturbed. Every significant damage event, every instance of near-total destruction and subsequent reanimation advances the process. Every malfunction in a stasis crypt during the sleep period, and there were many across 60 million years, because stasis systems were not built to maintain perfect function for 6,000 times longer than any civilization had ever planned for, produced its own pattern of damage in the organic architecture of the affected Necrons. The result is a spectrum. At one end, Necrons who awakened largely intact, their personalities and memories reasonably preserved, their cognitive function clear. These are fortunate, and their fortune was largely determined by the quality of the necrodermis body they received during biotransference, which was itself determined by their social class 60 million years ago. The nobility got the best bodies. The common people got what was left. The lottery of ancient social hierarchy now determines who awakens relatively whole and who awakens as something damaged in ways that cannot be repaired. At the middle of the spectrum, Necrons who are functional and effective but carry visible marks of the long sleep. Obsessions that have calcified into something structural. Beliefs that have lost their connection to current reality. The inability to update their model of the world against new information in certain domains. These are still capable of command, still dangerous, still contributing to their dynasties. But there is something off about them in ways that those who knew them before the sleep would recognize. At the far end, Necrons for whom the organic degradation has advanced so far that the continuity of identity has become a legal fiction. The entity currently occupying a given set of necrodermis frames may share that frame's historical record and most of its behavioral patterns, but the person who went into the stasis crypt and the person who came out of it are connected more by mechanical continuity than genuine psychological continuity. The gallery of specific Necron noble madnesses is one of the stranger catalogues in 40k lore. Nemesor Zandrek, who genuinely believes biotransference never happened and holds silent banquets to celebrate victories. The overlords who are trapped in replays of specific campaigns, unable to fully distinguish which war they are currently in. The Flayer kings, who retain their noble intelligence while losing their sanity to the Flayer virus. Each one a portrait of a specific personality eroded in a specific direction, the shape of the erosion telling you something about what they were before. And the aware ones, those who still have enough of themselves left to perceive the process, experience something uniquely terrible. They can see it happening. They can notice the fuzzier edges of memories that used to be clear. They can observe the slight drift in their own thought patterns, the subtle changes in what they find salient or important, or the gradual narrowing of whatever they use in place of emotional range. They are watching themselves dissolve, with the full cognitive capacity to understand what they are watching, using the very faculties that are dissolving to perform the observation. There is also the specific fear about their pre-biotransference memories. The organic lives they lived as Necrontyre, the people they knew, the experiences that defined them, the texture of the existences that were traded in the biofurnaces, are inconsistent in ways that go beyond normal memory degradation. Noble Necrons remember everything that happened after biotransference with perfect clarity, but their organic life memories are fragmentary, inconsistent, full of gaps that should not be there based on how memory normally works. And some philosophers within Necron civilization have examined this asymmetry and arrived at an uncomfortable hypothesis. The Satan may have deliberately damaged these memories during the biotransference process, not as a side effect of soul consumption, but as an intentional modification, removing the specific, detailed memories of organic existence to prevent the newly made Necrons from being paralyzed by grief, to make them more focused on the Satan's war, to ensure that the loss they had experienced was not immediately clear enough to produce the revolt that eventually happened anyway. If this is true, the Necrons carry a wound more precise than they knew. They mourn the loss of their organic existence. They know something was taken, but the detailed memories of what that existence felt like, the specific faces, the particular emotions, and the texture of the lives may have been specifically removed, leaving them unable to fully grieve because they cannot fully remember what they are grieving. The deceiver's cruelest legacy, possibly, outlasting the war in heaven and the great sleep and all the subsequent ages, still active in every mind that passed through the biofurnaces. Part 11. The dream that might be empty. Fear of reversing the irreversible. All of these fears, the Sea-Tan, the Tyranids, the Chaos Threat, the Flayer Virus, the Destroyers, the Outsider, the Void Dragon, the Dissolving Mind, are serious and some are immediate. But they are secondary to the fear that underlies all the others, the one that gives the entire structure of Necron civilization its shape and its desperate urgency. The fear that the reversal of biotransference might be impossible, or worse, that it might be possible, but insufficient. The reversal of biotransference is the project, the goal that the Silent King pursues, the dream that separates the functional portion of Necron civilization from the nihilistic abyss that the Destroyer cult occupies. The purpose that makes the difference between enduring with intent and enduring without it. The Necrontyre wanted immortality. The Necrons have immortality. And now many of them want the trade undone, want to go back, want the organic existence that the soul could inhabit, rather than the mechanical existence that the soul cannot. The technical problems are severe. Biotransference was performed through a combination of Necrontyre engineering and Sea-Tan divine power. The Necrontyre's contribution to that knowledge exists in partial, degraded, a 60-million-year-old form among the Cryptek caste, the closest thing Necron civilization has to scientists. The Satan's contribution is locked away in the minds of beings who have been shattered and imprisoned, and who have absolutely no incentive to assist in undoing their greatest achievement. Xeras, the most ambitious and least ethically constrained Cryptek in the setting, has spent his entire existence running experiments on captured organic species to understand biological systems at a level sufficient to inform reversal. He dissects living beings. He modifies and observes. He runs experiments of extraordinary thoroughness and extraordinary cruelty. Whether these experiments have produced actionable knowledge is not clearly established in the lore. His methods have not made him popular with the species he studies, though their opinions on the matter are not something he has incorporated into his research parameters. The Nephrec dynasty has specialized its entire necrodermis architecture around translocation, transforming into pure light for rapid movement, which is thought by some to reflect a dynasty oriented toward the idea of transformation itself as a technological domain. Their long-term motivation is described in the lore as the reversal of biotransference, the identification of organic species whose biology is compatible enough with Necron consciousness to serve as host bodies. They are, in effect, running an ongoing search for the biological raw material the reversal would require. But here is the question the lore raises carefully and does not definitively answer, even if the mechanics of reversal were perfected. And even if a Necron consciousness could be successfully transferred into an appropriate organic body, what would be restored? The body, yes. The organic experience, the sensation of warmth and breath and biological existence. These would return. But the soul was consumed. It was eaten by the Satan 60 million years ago. The Satan who consumed it are shattered, their power scattered across thousands of contained fragments. There is no retrieving what was eaten. There is no mechanism by which digested spiritual substance can be recovered. A Necron that achieves biological restoration would inhabit an organic body. It would have sensation again, but it would carry forward only the personality engrams and memory traces that survived in the metal, the already diminished, already eroding, already compromised versions of minds that were fuller and richer before they entered the biofurnaces. The result would be a being in an organic body with the mind of a Necron, and the mind of a Necron is a shadow of the mind of the Necrontire. This is the fear beneath the fear, that the dream of restoration, the project that has structured everything, might deliver the body but not the life. That the Necrontyre are gone, that what remains is the Necrons, and that putting a Necron consciousness into an organic body produces not a restored Necrontyre, but something new. A kind of being that has never existed before, in a body that is technically organic, with memories that are technically those of an ancient civilization, but without the spiritual wholeness that would have made that life feel complete. Some among the Necrons have thought about this. The most philosophical, the ones who have found ways to use the cognitive architecture they still possess to examine their own situation honestly. And the thinking does not consistently produce comfort. It produces the awareness that the dream of reversal is simultaneously the most important thing in Necron civilization, and the thing most burdened by the possibility that it cannot deliver what it promises. The dream is still worth pursuing. Without it, there is the abyss. But the fear of what the dream actually contains, of what they will find when and if they finally open the box, this fear runs underneath all the others, the foundation of the entire structure of Necron dread. Conclusion. What the fears of the immortal tell us. Step back for a moment and look at the whole picture. The most powerful material civilization in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy is afraid of the following things: losing the organic life in the galaxy that they need for their long-term plan, the dissolution of reality by chaos, their own imprisoned Satan weapons, a death curse from a god they destroyed, the nihilistic logic within their own psychology, a Satan so insane that not even their god-killing protocols could address it, a Satan shard sleeping under the most defended world in the Imperium, and their own minds slowly dissolving over geological timescales. Every single one of these fears is a direct consequence of the biotransference. The Satan shards they fear are Satan they created bodies for. The Flare virus came from a Satan they had to destroy because of what they had created. The Destroyer cult is populated by Necrons, whose nihilism is the logical endpoint of the biotransference's psychological effects. The Tyrannid threat is only a critical Necron concern, because the Necrons need organic life to undo the biotransference. The chaos threat matters because they are material beings with no warp presence, a state that is a consequence of the biotransference. The outsider went mad consuming Satan that the Necron tire had empowered. The void dragon's shard beneath Mars is a Catan they shattered during the revolt against the beings they had empowered. And their minds are dissolving because their organic components are failing within the mechanical bodies they chose in the biotransference. There is a perfect and terrible coherence to it. The decision in the biofurnaces is the root node of every significant fear they carry. Every branch of the fear tree leads back to that original moment, that original choice, that original trade of soul for immortality. This is what makes the Necrons genuinely extraordinary as a fictional faction. They are not simply powerful. They are not simply threatening. They are a civilization that made the most consequential mistake in galactic history and has been living with the consequences for longer than most species have existed. They are enormously capable in the domains that their mechanical nature enables, and profoundly vulnerable in the domains that require what their mechanical nature destroyed. They are carrying a 60-million-year-old wound toward a future that may or may not be able to heal it. As the immortal machines that sweep across battlefields with cold emerald fire, that strip worlds bare with quantum-level weapons, that speak in voices like distant grinding thunder and carry the full weight of geological time in every mechanical motion. They are afraid. And what they are afraid of is the echo of what they chose. They wanted to live forever. They got what they wanted, and they have spent 60 million years discovering, in steadily accumulating detail, what the price of that wish actually looks like. That's what the Necrons are actually afraid of. I hope this gave you something new to sit with, a way of understanding this faction that goes deeper than the standard framing, that shows you the tragedy inside the power and the grief inside the ancient eyes. The Necrons are one of the richest, most carefully constructed factions in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, and conversations like this one are why I keep coming back to them. There are so many threads to pull. The individual characters and their specific eccentric responses to eternal mechanical existence. The political dynamics between dynasties with very different philosophies about what it means to be Necron. The ongoing development of the Pariah Nexus and where that is taking the galactic narrative. We will go to all of those places. If this is the kind of deep, patient, atmospheric lore exploration you want more of, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. If this video gave you something to think about, leave a like. It helps more people find this content and it means a lot to me as a creator. Leave a comment below and tell me what you thought. But which fear you find the most compelling, which angle you'd want to explore further. These conversations shape where the channel goes. Until next time, in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the oldest things in the galaxy are still afraid of something. And that makes them more interesting, not less. Sleep well. Q. On 40,000. Deep Lore, ASMR style. For the restless mind and the patient ear. Section 9. The Dragon Beneath Mars. The Void Dragon and the Unguarded Prison. There is a location inside the Imperium of Man, at the very heart of humanity's civilization, where the Necrons once sent a suicide fleet simply to gather intelligence. 5 Necron Shroud-class light cruisers punched through the Sol System's defensive perimeter in 998 M41, knowing they would almost certainly be destroyed before reaching their objective. They were destroyed. The information they gathered, if they gathered any before being annihilated, has never been made public. No reasonable military analysis explains this mission as an attack. 5 ships cannot threaten Mars against the forces arrayed in its defense. The only interpretation that makes any operational sense is reconnaissance, a one-way trip to observe something the Necrons consider important enough to sacrifice ships and crews for a single moment of information, something sleeping beneath the surface of the red planet in geological silence. In the formations of the Noctis Labyrinth, sealed in a Necron-built stasis tomb, a Citan shard has been imprisoned for approximately 10,000 years, and placed there not by Necron engineers, but by the being who would eventually become the Emperor of mankind, before the Imperium existed, before he had that title. The Emperor found this entity and fought it with the full force of his considerable power. He could not kill it. He could only imprison it. So he sealed it beneath Mars and left it there, where its passive influence would seep upward through rock and history into the culture growing above it. What is sleeping beneath Mars is widely theorized to be a major shard of Magladroth, the Void Dragon, the Satan, whose domain was the material realm itself. Technology, physical matter, the laws that govern how things are built and unmade and built again. During the war in heaven, the Void Dragon's warriors were so formidable that the Old Ones created the Blackstone fortresses as a specific countermeasure, enormous weapons powered by the willingly given souls of Aeldari seers, because nothing else in the Old Ones' available arsenal was adequate to oppose them. The Void Dragon designed the Blackstone pylons that suppress warp intrusion. It conceived the fundamental architecture of Necron technological supremacy. It is the intelligence behind more of what makes the Necrons powerful than even the Necrons may now fully understand, 60 million years removed from the collaboration. When the revolt came and the god-killing weapons were used, the Void Dragon was shattered and imprisoned like the others. But one major shard, potentially the primary fragment, or potentially the largest piece remaining, came to rest in what would eventually be called the solar system. The Emperor found it, spent enormous power fighting it, could not destroy it, and imprisoned it beneath the surface of Mars in a Necron-built stasis container that had apparently been prepared in advance by someone with knowledge of the shard's trajectory and final location. The passive influence of this imprisoned shard has been saturating Martian civilization for thousands of years. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the tech priests who worship technology as divinity, who believe flesh is weak and metal is pure, who seek the augmentation of their biological bodies with mechanical components as a form of spiritual advancement, emerged from a culture continuously marinating in the Void Dragon's whispered nature. A Satan, whose domain is technology, imprisoned beneath their most sacred world, broadcasting its essence upward through sealed stone into the minds and rituals and doctrines of the faithful above. Some of the most perceptive scholars within the Mechanicus itself, and some of the most thorough inquisitors who have followed the evidence to its conclusions, have arrived at an uncomfortable hypothesis. The machine god their order reveres may not be the Emperor at all. It may be the Void Dragon. The entire cult Mechanicus, with its 10,000-year history and its billions of devotees across every forge world in the Imperium, may be a Satan worship cult that began unconsciously through ambient influence and has been sustained by accumulated faith ever since. The sacred rituals, the prayers to the machine spirit, but the doctrine that the Omnissiah is the source of all technological knowledge. These may be the organized theology of a god in a box, whispering its nature through kilometers of Martian rock. For the Necrons, the Mars situation is a source of anxious attention they cannot resolve through direct action. A major shard of one of their most dangerous former masters sits in territory they cannot access, maintained in containment by a prison built by an entity whose active power has been essentially absent for 10,000 years. The Necron stasis technology underlying the containment is extraordinarily durable. It was built to last epochs, and it has lasted. But durable is not infinite. The Emperor's ability to actively reinforce and maintain the prison has been reduced to near zero since his mortification on the Golden Throne. And the prison continues because the technology is good, not because anyone is actively keeping it. The scenario that concerns Necron's strategic planning most is not an attack on Mars, not a military action that somehow breaks the containment. It is the simple possibility that across sufficient time, even the best stasis technology degrades. That 10,000 years of unmonitored operation introduces risks. That the shard beneath the Noctis labyrinth is slightly less contained today than it was yesterday, and slightly less contained yesterday than the day before. And across the kind of timeframes the Necrons understand viscerally, this is not a reassuring trend. What would a fully manifest major void dragon shard do if the containment failed? A minor fragment that escaped the Aratep dynasty destroyed an entire dynasty and consumed 12 worlds. The shard beneath Mars is significantly larger than what the Aratep dynasty was studying. It would emerge into a star system that contains the spiritual and political center of the Imperium of man, surrounded by a civilization whose entire religion and technological development it has been shaping through passive influence for 10,000 years. Whether that influence would make humanity sympathetic to a newly freed god, or whether the Mechanicus would simply become its most willing servants, this is not a scenario anyone in the current galaxy is prepared to address with confidence. The Necrons watch Mars because they have no other option. They send ships they know will be destroyed for a few moments of observation. But they monitor from whatever distance their instruments can reach, trying to determine whether the thing sleeping under the red planet is still sleeping at the same depth, still sleeping at the same level of suppression, still safely contained by engineering that has been running unsupervised for 100 centuries. They look for signs. They do not like what the looking tells them about the trend lines. Section 10. The long dissolution. Fear of the slowly disappearing self. The fears we have examined so far all involve external threats, entities and forces and civilizational processes that threaten the Necrons from outside. But the most intimate and in some ways most persistently terrible fear is internal. It lives inside the Necrons themselves, in the organic matter embedded within their necrodermis frames, are degrading so slowly that any individual measurement seems negligible, and the cumulative result across geological time is catastrophic. The Necrons are losing their minds. Not all of them, not all at once, not in any single catastrophic event. In the slow, patient way that entropy operates when given sufficient time and no counteracting force, and the specific mechanism by which it happens is inseparable from the fundamental nature of what they are. Necron consciousness lives in organic components. The living metal of their bodies is functionally immortal under normal conditions. It regenerates from nearly any damage, maintains its structure through conditions that would destroy organic matter many times over, and can in principle endure until the end of the universe itself. But the organic matter that makes genuine cognition possible, brain tissue, neural architecture, the biological systems that support the continuity of memory and personality and genuine selfhood, does not share this immortality. It degrades. Slowly, by the standards of a human lifespan, catastrophically slowly, but consistently, across the geological timescales that constitute Necron experience. Every cycle of the Great Sleep accelerates this process, because the long stasis periods reduce the active cellular maintenance that would otherwise retard entropy, allowing subtle organic deterioration to accumulate during periods when no corrective mechanism is operating. Every significant battle damage event, every near-total destruction and subsequent reanimation, every instance of catastrophic physical trauma that requires extensive reconstruction, produces its own pattern of organic degradation in the rebuilt components. Every malfunction in a stasis crypt, of which there were many across 60 million years of automated maintenance, damaged the organic architecture of the affected Necrons in ways that the reanimation protocols could only partially address. The result is a spectrum of cognitive integrity that runs from largely intact at one end to essentially gone at the other. The largely intact Necrons are those whose fortune, in the cold lottery of ancient class hierarchy, gave them the finest necrodermis bodies, the ones with the most sophisticated cognitive architecture, given to those of the highest rank 60 million years ago when the bodies were initially assigned. Or the quality of your mind in the 41st millennium is, for a Necron, substantially determined by what your social status was in the Necrontire Empire before the biotransference. Along the spectrum toward the other end, the catalogue of specific ways high-ranking Necron nobles have degraded is one of the stranger collections in the 40k setting. Nemesor Zahandrek, brilliant commander, effective strategist, genuinely capable military mind, is functionally delusional about the most basic fact of what he is. He believes himself still flesh and blood. He holds elaborate silent banquets to celebrate victories, the table set, the chairs occupied by nothing, the celebration performed for an audience that has not existed for 60 million years. And he issues formal challenges to honorable combat against enemy commanders who will never receive them, because in his internal model of reality, the protocols of Necrontyre noble warfare are still applicable and meaningful. His loyal Vargard Oberon manages this gap between Zahandrek's experienced reality and the actual reality with the particular devotion of a being who has been performing this service for an extremely long time, protecting Zahandrek from rivals who would exploit the delusion, ensuring the dynasty benefits from the genuine military genius that is still present while containing the worst consequences of the disconnection from reality that has grown around it. The relationship between Zahandrek and Oberon is one of the most quietly human things in the Necron lore. The devoted caretaker and the brilliant broken mind, and sustained by loyalty across geological time. Other nobles have developed their own specific deteriorations. Those who can no longer distinguish between different wars, who are relitigating campaigns that ended 1,000,000 years ago without being certain whether that specific campaign is the current engagement or a memory. Those whose obsessions have become so total that the obsession is now the entirety of the self. Nothing exists outside the collection, the rivalry, the calculation, because nothing else survived the grinding of the long years. Those whose philosophical frameworks have calcified into loops, repeating the same conclusions regardless of new evidence, no longer capable of updating the model because the cognitive architecture that supports update has been eroded. Or what makes this fear contemporary rather than merely historical is the awareness the intact ones carry. The Necrons who still have enough of themselves preserved to think clearly about their own situation understand that this erosion is ongoing. They can observe it in themselves across centuries of self-attention, memories that were vivid becoming fuzzy, interests that once felt genuine becoming more effortful to sustain, the subtle drift in their own patterns of thought that they can only detect by comparing their current cognition against historical records of their own previous statements. They know the process is progressing. They know that the mind they have now is not what it was before the Great Sleep, and that it will not be the same as what it is now in another 100,000 years. As the self is dissolving in slow motion, and the remaining self is coherent enough to watch it happening, and precise enough in its suffering to know exactly what it is watching. There is also the specific fear, touched on in earlier sections, that the fragmentary nature of their pre-biotransference memories is not merely the result of natural organic degradation over time. Noble Necrons have essentially perfect recall of everything after the biotransference. Their memories of their organic lives, of who they were as Necrontyre, of the people and places and experiences that constituted the existences that were traded in the biofurnaces, are inconsistent and gapped in ways that should not fit ordinary memory degradation patterns. The asymmetry is notable. Some of the most analytical Necron philosophers have examined it and reached the conclusion that the Cetan, in the moment of performing the biotransference, may have deliberately erased or corrupted these memories as part of the transformation process, not as an incidental side effect, but as an intentional modification to make the newly created Necrons more focused on the C'tan's war and less consumed by grief for what had just been taken. If this hypothesis is correct, the Necrons do not merely mourn a loss they remember. They mourn a loss whose specific content was taken along with the loss itself. They know the shape of the absence. They cannot fully feel the weight of it because they cannot fully remember what they are missing. The deceiver's most thorough victory possibly, where it was not the biotransference itself, but the specific edit made during it. The removal of the evidence that would have made the betrayal immediately comprehensible, leaving only the vague, unarticulated sense of a wound without the detailed knowledge of what made the wound. Section 11. The dream beneath the dream. Fearing that reversal may not be enough. Every fear we have explored in this video connects to something that can, in principle, be fought. The Tyranids can be opposed militarily and strategically. The Citan shards can be maintained in their prisons. The Chaos threat can be addressed through the Pariah Nexus. The Flayer virus can be managed, contained. Its spread slowed, even if it cannot be cured. The Destroyer cult can be controlled, its members quarantined from the broader dynastic society. The Outsider can be monitored from a distance. The Void Dragon's shard can be watched, but the deepest fear, the one that is in some ways the foundation all the others are built on, cannot be directly fought. It can only be lived with, and it is the fear that the reversal of biotransference, the dream that gives Necron civilization its purpose, and that keeps the majority of the Necrons on the functional rather than nihilistic side of their psychology, might not deliver what they are imagining it will. Understanding why this fear is so significant requires understanding what the reversal of biotransference actually means to the Necrons. Not technically. The technical meaning is the restoration of Necron consciousness to organic bodies, but in terms of what they hope it will give them. What they are expecting from the reversal is not simply a change of substrate. They are expecting the restoration of experience, the return of the fullness of what it meant to be alive. When alive meant something beyond mechanical continuity, the possibility of genuine joy and genuine connection and genuine engagement with existence, rather than the pale approximation of these things that mechanical immortality allows. The technical challenges are severe and well documented in the lore. The Citan designed biotransference, and the Citan are now imprisoned and shattered. The Necrontier's own understanding of the process was partial at the time, and has degraded over 60 million years. The Cryptex have been working on reversal for their entire existence, and have not produced a solution. Ceres, who has conducted the most extensive biological research of any Necron in pursuit of this goal, has produced detailed knowledge of organic systems through methods no organic being would consent to, but has not announced a technical breakthrough. Leaving aside the question of whether reversal is technically achievable, the philosophical question is whether it would achieve what the Necrons actually want from it. The body would return. Warmth, sensation, biological experience. These would be present again. The organic substrate of existence, which was traded in the biofurnaces, would be restored. The soul was consumed. It was eaten by the Citan 60 million years ago and digested into divine sustenance. The Citan who consumed it are shattered, their power scattered. The original divine form that absorbed the Necrontier's spiritual substance no longer existing in a form that could return what it took. The soul is gone in the most complete sense. There is no mechanism by which it could be recovered, no process by which consumed spiritual energy is preserved for future retrieval, no authority holding it in escrow pending the discovery of a reversal technique. A Necron consciousness restored to organic form would be a Necron mind in a biological body, not a restored Necrontier, not the person who went into the biofurnace 60 million years ago, not even an approximation of that person, because the personality engrams and memory traces that survived in the metal are the already degraded, already compressed, already eroded residue of the original self after the soul's removal. By putting that residue into an organic body would not restore the soul. It would not restore the full richness of experience that a soul-complete consciousness has. It would produce a being in flesh with the inner condition of a Necron, able to sense and experience organically, but carrying the same fundamental absence of soul that makes Necron existence hollow. Better than current mechanical existence, almost certainly. The organic substrate of sensation and biological life has genuine value even without the soul's enhancement of it. This is not a trivial improvement, but not the full restoration that the dream implies, not the return to what they were before the biofurnaces, not the undoing of the damage. Some of the most honest and philosophical Necrons have sat with this question long enough to acknowledge the uncertainty. Or Sharik himself, who has spent 60 million years with his full memory of the biotransference and what it took, surely understands this as well as anyone. The question of whether the reversal will deliver what the civilization is fighting for has no certain answer. The dream might be exactly what it promises, and the reversal, when achieved, might provide the full restoration of rich, soul-connected organic experience. The soul's absence might prove less catastrophic for organic existence than it is for mechanical existence. Perhaps being in a body with sensation and biological complexity provides enough grounding that the soullessness is no longer the dominant feature of the experience. Or the reversal might produce something that is better than being a Necron, and still not what the Necrontyr were. And the Necrons who achieve it would live in organic bodies with the same fundamental absence that has made 60 million years of mechanical existence hollow. Different substrate, same wound. This fear that the dream is incomplete, that the goal might not deliver what the goal promises, is not something the Necrons can resolve through research or combat or strategic maneuvering. It is the uncertainty that lives at the center of their civilization's purpose, and it is not going away until the reversal is actually achieved and its results are actually experienced. Until then, the dream continues because it must, because the alternative to the dream is not acceptable, and the fear that the dream may not be enough continues alongside it, quietly, as it has continued since the biofurnaces closed and the first Necrons looked at what they had become. Closing, what the fears of the oldest reveal. Look at the full structure of what we have examined. The most powerful material civilization in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy is afraid of the Tyranids consuming the organic life it needs for its future. It is afraid of chaos dissolving physical reality. It is afraid of the gods it imprisons and uses as weapons. It is afraid of a death curse from a god it obliterated 60 million years ago. It is afraid of the nihilistic philosophy spreading within its own population. It is afraid of a Catan too insane to contain, sitting in exile outside the galaxy. It is afraid of a Satan sleeping under the most defended territory in the Imperium. It is afraid of its own mind slowly dissolving. And it is afraid that the dream sustaining its civilization might not deliver what it promises, even if it is achieved. The closed circle, fear of a population that can only shrink. There is one fear we have not yet named directly, but which shapes every military and strategic decision the Necrons make. It is not as dramatic as the Satan shards or the Tyranid fleets. It is quieter, more arithmetic, and in the long run, it may be the most structurally serious problem of all. The Necrons cannot grow their population. This is not a temporary condition waiting to be addressed. It is a permanent consequence of what biotransference created. Every Necron who exists today was a Necrontyr who entered a biofurnace 60 million years ago. There are no new Necrons being born. There is no biological reproduction possible. They have no organic bodies capable of it. There is no equivalent recruitment process, no path by which new beings can be initiated into the Necron warrior caste, the way a Space Marine chapter recruits from human populations, or the way the Orcs generate new members simply through their fungal biology. The total number of Necrons available to Necron civilization was fixed at the moment the Great Sleep began, and every casualty since that moment that could not be recovered through reanimation protocols has permanently reduced that total. Think about what this means across geological timescales. In any given century, across all the tomb worlds and all the campaigns and all the engagements that Necrons fight, some percentage of losses are unrecoverable, components too thoroughly destroyed, organic substrate too completely eliminated, phase-out recovery failing for one reason or another. Individually, these losses are small. Across thousands of centuries, they accumulate. The Necrons fighting in the 41st millennium are fighting with a population that is meaningfully smaller than the one that entered the Great Sleep 60 million years ago, even after accounting for recoveries and reanimations, because no recovery system is 100% effective, and no reanimation protocol catches every loss. The Necrons know this. More precisely, the Necron nobility, who still have sufficient cognitive integrity to process this kind of long-term analysis, know it, and it informs every tactical calculation they make. This is why Necron commanders phase out from engagements that look like they are going badly rather than fighting to the last warrior. Not because they lack courage. Courage in the martial sense is a concept that applies differently to beings who can regenerate, but because they are doing the math. Every warrior committed to an engagement that is going poorly is an investment that may not return. Every unrecoverable loss is a subtraction from the fixed total that will never be compensated for by new members. A military that understands this calculus fights differently than one that can simply recruit replacements. The fear this creates is low and continuous rather than sharp and immediate. It is the background awareness that the civilization is a closed system, that the system can only get smaller, and that the rate of shrinkage, while perhaps very slow by any ordinary reckoning, is still positive. The math points in only one direction over a long enough time frame. The only thing that changes this trajectory is solving biotransference reversal, producing bodies again, producing new people who are genuinely new, rather than merely continuations of the ancient pattern. And solving biotransference reversal requires surviving long enough to solve it, which requires maintaining sufficient military capacity, which requires not losing too many warriors in the wars being fought in the meantime. The population ceiling fear is inextricable from the biotransference reversal dream. They are the same anxiety expressed in two different directions, one looking at the present shrinkage, one looking at the future that would stop it. What the Necrons actually want. The aspiration beneath the fear. Understanding the Necrons' fears fully requires understanding what they are afraid of losing, which requires understanding what they actually want. Not just what they say they want in the grand strategic framing of dynasty rebuilding and galactic reclamation, but what they actually want in the deepest, most personal sense that beings of their nature can have once. They want to feel alive again. This sounds almost too simple, but when you sit with the sum total of what biotransference took, the soul, the organic sensation, the genuine emotional depth, yet the full resonance of experience that a being with body and soul and all its biological complexity can have. What the Necrons want is not power or dominance or revenge against the species that colonized their tomb worlds during the Great Sleep. Those things are present in Necron civilization, certainly, but they are secondary. The primary want, the one that organizes the Silent King's return and the Nephrek dynasty's specialization and Xerxes' experimental obsession and the entire project of biotransference reversal, is the want to experience the universe as something more than cold processing, to feel warm rather than approximate warmth, to genuinely love something rather than functionally value it, to be in the full sense of what being means to a consciousness with both a body and a soul. What this want makes every fear we have discussed more comprehensible in terms of its weight and its urgency. The Tyranids are terrifying not primarily because they are militarily dangerous. The Necrons have the military capacity to fight them, but because they threaten the biological substrate that the deepest want depends on. Chaos is terrifying not primarily because its servants are powerful. The Necrons can fight demons adequately, but because the dissolution of physical reality would make the want permanently impossible. The Citan shards are a source of dread not primarily because of their destructive capability. The Necrons can deploy them carefully, but because the possibility of their escape and reassembly represents a return to the condition of being enslaved to divine masters, who would again consume whatever spiritual substance the Necrons have managed to preserve. Every fear is proportional to how directly it threatens the one thing the Necrons have been trying to get back since the moment the biofurnaces opened 60 million years ago. The tragedy is that this want, enormous and real and 60 million years old, may not be fully satisfiable even if every fear is addressed. Even if the Tyranids are stopped and the chaos threat is sealed, and the Citan shards remain contained, and the outsider stays in its exile, and the Void Dragon sleeps on undisturbed, and the destroyer cult is managed, and the population ceiling is somehow addressed. Even if all of that happens and biotransference reversal is technically achieved, and Necron consciousness returns to biological form, the soul is still gone. A Necron in a living body would be warmer than a Necron in metal, would feel sensation, would experience biological existence with all its textures and resonances. But the soul that would have made that existence fully real, fully resonant in the cosmological sense, fully connected to the spiritual dimension of the universe, that was consumed 60 million years ago and cannot be returned. While the organic experience would be genuine, the soul-complete richness of what the Necrontire once had would remain absent. Whether this absence would be as devastating in a biological body as it is in a mechanical one is genuinely uncertain. Perhaps the biological substrate of sensation and connection provides enough grounding that the soullessness becomes livable rather than defining. Perhaps the experience of being warm, of breathing, of feeling the presence of other organic beings in the full biological sense would provide something that the metal bodies never could, and that something would be sufficient. The lore does not tell us the answer, because the reversal has never been achieved in any canonical account. The Necrons are pursuing a dream that may deliver everything it promises. Or may deliver something real, but less than everything. They cannot know which until they achieve it, and they cannot achieve it until they survive long enough to solve it. And they survive by managing the fears that threaten them, the fears that are all, ultimately, threats to the possibility of the one thing they have been trying to recover since before recorded history began. The weight of ancient memory. Individuals in the long dark. No discussion of what the Necrons fear is complete without acknowledging the individuals who carry these fears in their specific forms, because the fears are not abstractions experienced by a monolithic civilization. They are lived, in their particular flavors, by specific beings, with specific histories and specific responses. Yet the Silent King, Sarek, carries the most complete version of all these fears simultaneously, because he has never entered the Great Sleep and has never lost the continuity of his memory. He remembers the Necrontyr. He remembers the lives before the biofurnaces, not in the fragmentary way that other Necron nobles remember them, because Zarek was the one who made the decision, and who therefore found it impossible to forget it, who has spent 60 million years unable to stop remembering what the decision cost. He is the one Necron for whom the grief of the biotransference is not a distant, half-understood ache, but a continuous, specific, fully remembered wound. He is also the one Necron who, by having lived through all of it, without the interruption of sleep, carries the clearest vision of what the Necrons actually are and what they actually face. The tyrannid threat he assessed directly in the void between galaxies. The chaos threat he understands from having built the pylon network that has been suppressing it. The Citan situation he understands from having personally supervised the revolt that created it. The population problem he can calculate with 60 million years of uninterrupted data. The biotransference reversal challenge he understands from having overseen the original biotransference. The weight of what Sarek knows is, by any reasonable assessment, enormous. He has perfect memory of every mistake and every consequence spanning geological time. He is working with everything available to him to address the consequences of the original mistake. And he cannot know whether he will succeed. Trazyn the Infinite sits with these fears differently, by constructing a large enough project of collection and preservation that the fears can be, not eliminated, but placed at a slight distance. The collection is not a cure, but it is a framework, something to organize the endless years around that is specific and tangible, and produces something that functions as satisfaction when it goes well. Trazyn's museum is a monument to the mortal experience that was taken in the biofurnaces. He has, in his own eccentric way, dedicated his existence to preserving the evidence of what organic civilizations produce. There is something quietly moving about this if you look at it carefully. A soulless, ancient machine, preserving the records and relics, and sometimes the living specimens of soul-complete civilizations, because some part of what remains of him recognizes that these things are worth keeping, even if he cannot fully feel why. Orikan the diviner sits with the fears through the mathematics of time, running calculations that extend so far in both directions that the scale of the fears begins to feel, not smaller, but properly contextualized. There is a specific kind of relationship with anxiety that very long-term temporal perspective produces. Not comfort exactly, but proportion. The biotransference was 60 million years ago. The galaxy has survived that. The fears are real and serious and ongoing. The mathematics of celestial movement continues regardless. Orikan engages with the mathematics, and in engaging with it, must find something to be genuinely present for rather than merely enduring. These three figures, and they are just the most prominent examples from a very large gallery of individuals who each carry the fears in their own ways, illustrate something important about the Necrons that the faction summary framing tends to miss. They are not a monolithic entity. They are beings, damaged and ancient and afraid, pursuing the project of their civilization with the tools and capacities that 60 million years of hollow immortality has left them with. Each one finding a slightly different relationship with the fears that their existence requires them to carry. Every single one of these fears is a consequence of the biotransference. The Citan shards they carry in prisons are Catan they originally empowered. The Flayer virus is a death curse from a Citan destroyed in the revolt against Citan they had empowered. The Destroyer cult's nihilism is the endpoint of the psychology created by biotransference. The Tyranids are only existentially threatening because of the organic life requirement the biotransference made necessary. The Chaos threat matters to them specifically because they are soulless material beings with no warp presence, which is the condition the biotransference created. The Outsider went mad consuming Satan the Necrontyr had first given bodies to. The Void Dragon shard beneath Mars is a Catan they shattered in the revolt against Satan they had originally summoned. Their minds are dissolving because they are organic consciousness in mechanical bodies, which is what biotransference produced. And the uncertainty about reversal exists because the soul was taken in the biofurnaces and the soul cannot be returned. There is a perfect and devastating coherence to this. The original decision radiates forward in every direction across all of Necron history, producing consequences that 60 million years of effort have not resolved and may never resolve. The Necrons are powerful in exactly the ways that do not require what was taken from them, and afraid of exactly the things that threaten what was left. This is the tragedy of the Necrons, not the dramatic tragedy of a sudden fall, the quiet, geological tragedy of an ancient people still living with the full cost of a decision made before anything else in the galaxy had evolved, still fighting it, still pursuing the possibility of its reversal, while still afraid of what happens if they cannot reverse it. What makes this tragedy genuinely affecting, rather than merely interesting as a piece of world building, is its recognizability. The Necron situation is an extreme version of something that resonates with ordinary mortal experience. The long-term consequences of a choice made under pressure, made in desperation, made with the best available information and the worst possible outcome. The Necrontyr were not stupid. They were not evil. They were a civilization that had been dying slowly for their entire history, that had been refused the help they needed by the beings who could have given it, that reached the limit of what they could endure and accepted an offer that looked like salvation. But the fact that the offer was designed to destroy them did not make their desperation illegitimate. It made the betrayal more complete. The Necrons carrying the consequences of that choice 60 million years later are not villains in the conventional sense either. They are beings trying to survive the aftermath of a wound inflicted before any currently living species existed. They have done terrible things in pursuit of survival. The wars of secession, the biotransference itself, the enslavement of the Setan servant races during the war in heaven, the harvesting of populations across the galaxy to feed their former gods. These things are real, and they are dark. but they sit within the context of a civilization that was itself betrayed first, that paid a price no civilization should be asked to pay, and that has been living with that payment ever since. The immortal machines sweeping across battlefields with cold emerald fire, stripping matter from their enemies with weapons of atomic precision, moving with the terrible certainty of beings who have been doing exactly this for longer than any other species has existed. They carry this. Under the cold silver and the emerald light and the 60 million years of tactical experience, they carry what...
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.